the primary concerns that have been identified for why the southern residents are in trouble. Number one, far and above, is lack of salmon. If they had enough to eat, the other issues would be still issues, but not nearly have the same impact that they do because there is not enough salmon. Toxics are the toxicants in the food chain are the other issue. And then the disturbance from vessel traffic.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another exciting virtual tour with the Foss Waterway Seaport. And of course, me, your guide this evening, Chris Staudinger with Pretty Gritty Tours. And tonight, we are talking about those lovable carnivorous pandas of the sea, orcas, which I'm told I'm not supposed to call them anymore. Now, I don't know where everyone's expertise is on orcas. I myself am not an expert, but we are joined by an expert this evening. We will get to speak with Stephanie Raymond of the Orca Network, who is an educator and advocate. Between her expertise, the knowledgeable people at the Foss Waterway Seaport, and a generous contribution of information and photographs from Brooke Casanova, a local whale expert, we were able to curate information. So think of this as your entry point to orca knowledge in the area. There are a variety of orcas. In fact, 3 different ecotypes in Puget Sound. There's southern residents, there's the big transient whales, and then there's the offshore orcas. And each of these orcas is a completely separate group. They don't understand each other, they don't mix with each other, and most importantly for us tonight, they don't eat the same thing. Southern residents are orcas that are critically endangered, and they're endangered for a variety of reasons, but peak amongst them is that their diet consists of Chinook salmon. That is what they have eaten since time immemorial. It's what they continue to eat right now. And due to pollutants, noise pollution, and loss of salmon habitat, the orca are suffering to the point where there are some various serious conversations that need to be had around them. This, of course, what brings us to tonight, because orca are incredible. They're not just beautiful and brilliant, but they are a huge part of this region's soul. And this is not just the third Thursday about orcas, but it's also Orca Month at Foss Waterway Seaport. And in fact, coming up on June 29th, it will be Tacoma Ocean Fest, an opportunity to celebrate, to learn, and to protect the oceans in this region. And so a lot of the exhibits at Foss Waterway Seaport for this month are focused on the conversation around orcas, where they live, what they thrive on, and what makes them so resplendent. Now, one of the big things that's going to be opening up soon here, it's not yet released, but the Foss Waterway Seaport has begun working with a local artist, Ricky Loves Painting, who I think if you've been in the area, you've probably seen a few of his paintings. The one I'm most familiar with is on 6th Avenue. It's that Technicolor prism one that says rad. He has done a lot of incredible work in the area, and this is a mock-up of the mural that he's currently working on inside the Foss Waterway Seaport building. If you were around in April when we spoke with River Meshi, we got to see the Mother of the Waters mural that was freshly opened there. This is the new one that's going on the wall just underneath the articulated whale skeleton there. This is a sunset photograph from local photographer Scott Sherman, and it is depicting a breaching of this fine young woman. This is J2, or Granny, who was born, they believe, in 1936, and then she passed away in 2016, but was one of the most iconic and famous whales of the J-pod, a member of the Southern residents. But perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself here. What are we talking about? Not just conservation, but really understanding the orcas and the challenges that they face. Chief among them, of course, is the loss of salmon, but that is a multifold discussion. Micropollutants are a big part of that, because micropollutants, including fat-soluble microplastics and chemicals, get put into the waterway. The popular phrase in this region is, if it hits the ground, it's in the sound. A lot of those micropollutants go out into the food web and are absorbed by zoo and phytoplankton, which then are consumed by larger fish and larger fish and larger, until you reach the top of that food chain, which of course is the apex predator in the region, the orca, or the killer whale. Now, salmon are the most viable and important resource for the southern residents because it is the one thing that they eat. And that is one of the key differences of whales in the region. And we know because we can look at the makeup of these whales, and we've been able to observe them for a really long time. One of the most famous whales outside of Granny, I think, is L25. If you're not familiar, ocean sun. Scientists in the region believe that she is the oldest marine mammal in the region and possibly the world right now. We're not really sure. I'm not, at least. But L25 is assumed or estimated to have been born in 1923, making her really one of the grand matriarchs of the region. And that's something to take away about orcas, is that they live in these matriarchal pods or matrilineal societies where a mother has children, and then those children, those calves, will stay with their mother for the entirety of their lives, hunting, traveling, and communicating in those groups. But not all orca groups are the same, which is a key takeaway from tonight. There are southern residents, which follow, you kind of see the route here, all the way from sort of the southern end of California, the northern end of Mexico, up to Alaska, the southern portion of Alaska. And the three groups that we deal with in Puget Sound are offshore orcas, resident orcas, in particular for us, southern residents, and then transient orcas, or bigs. Bigs killer whales, bigs orcas. And transient is sort of a misnomer, I think, because they have become less transient over the years, really finding a habitat here in Puget Sound and sticking around. And the thing that has made it so desirable for them is what they eat. So let me break it down. Northern and southern resident orcas are defined not just by their geographic and genetic features, but also by their diet, which has been passed down through learning and tradition from generation to generation to focus just on salmon. Whereas Biggs orcas, named after Michael Bigg, the naturalist and scientist and doctor that was responsible for curating a lot of their information, eat marine mammals. So we're talking sea lions, seals, and other things like that. And this has wide-ranging effects that we'll dive into a little bit later on. But the big one is not just how they eat, but how they hunt. Biggs orcas hunt marine mammals and do so silently. They don't communicate with each other as often as southern residents do when they're hunting. And so they can actually mask their presence in a lot of the sound pollution that happens from engine noise in Puget Sound. Whereas that same engine noise is devastating to the southern residents because it disrupts their ability to echolocate to each other and to actually pinpoint where their food is. And for more information on that, if you find yourself at the Foss Waterway Seaport a little bit later, you can actually look up a lot about not just the orcas themselves, but how they echolocate and how they hunt using that. So we're not going to get too much into what it is that makes the whales capable of echolocation, but it's important to know that that sound pollution created by engines and marine traffic can have two very different effects. For the southern residents, it is a devastating blow. For the bigs, we're not seeing as much detriment, but I have an audio recording here from one of the whale conservation groups that hosted on Port of Vancouver. You can hear northern resident orcas communicating to each other, and then it's drowned out by engine noise to really give a good representation of what that's like. I'm not a marine scientist, but I can tell that that's disruptive. And I've been, in my layman's terms, comparing it to the fact that if you were at a Metallica concert and trying to convey vital information to your family so that they didn't die, they couldn't hear you, that would be a problem. If you find yourself in that loud environment and it's destroying your way of life, that becomes an issue. And so seeing the ability for bigs and southern residents to exist in this environment has been a big part of the discussion on how to take action to save orcas in the region. Not just diet and ability to communicate, but also when you look at the species between the two types of orcas in particular here in Puget Sound, they are different. They're different in size, they're different in coloration, they're different in the bone density of their beaks. And I'm not 100% sure, but I believe there have been new scientific papers put out to actually have these different types of orcas listed as different species. But currently, they're known as different ecotypes, the 3 different ecotypes of orcas in our region, but there are multiple ecotypes of orcas in the northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere throughout. When we're talking about the northern hemisphere, there's residents, bigs, offshore, North Atlantic type 1 and North Atlantic type 2. But of course, the ones that we're concerned with are primarily bigs and southern residents. And here's a good map showing the migratory and travel patterns of these southern residents. And they can go distances farther than we had previously thought possible. They can travel over 130 miles in a single day, is what current research suggests. Despite that, we know a significant amount about them. And the J-pod in particular is one of the most beloved and well-documented groups of marine mammals in the world. There are currently, by 2023, 74 known members to the southern residents pods, and they've been listed in J-pod, K-pod, and L-pod. J-pod, I'll make this a little bigger for you here, has these various numbers in them. So J-pod has 25 members, K-pod has 15 members, L-pod has 34 members, and in those pods, they've been broken down into various other groups. If you're looking for more information, Orca Network in particular has a lot of really great documentation on the pods, the family makeups, who has been born to who. It's got like Game of Thrones level of hereditary information so that you can see all the various years of whale out there. Also, though, orcaconservancy.org, a lot of online resources are available to you so that you can better acquaint yourself with these whales. And I can't stress how important that part is. The more that we are familiar with the orcas in the region and the more that we are able to understand them and be endeared to them, the more likely it is that we are to take action to help save them. And thus ourselves, because orcas are the canary in the mine shaft, my friends. They are an apex predator that rely on keystone species like salmon, but also the health of the environment. And the same things that can spell the end of orcas are the exact same things that could spell our own demise. So seeing the population decline in something like orcas should be the bellwether that warns us about our own conditions. So if you're not already endeared to the whales or the porpoises, then you should be concerned for your own well-being as well. When you're looking at bigs and resident killer whales, you can see that they have a tremendous amount of space and territory that they cover. But when we're talking about southern residents, it's really southern Alaska to southern California is the main range that we know of right now. And the way that you identify them is visually. They don't have tags, they don't have markers, but the dorsal fins are different. You can see each individual orca's identity by its dorsal fin, and not just identify it between bigs and resident, but also the individual itself. And so bigs have a very different saddle patch, or that area of coloration behind the dorsal fin, in comparison to resident orcas. And the resident orcas actually have a whole explosion of identity markers that are seen in the saddle patch behind them. You can find a lot of information both on the Orca Network as well as the Foss Waterway Seaport about that. But these are distinct populations, genetically, language, and diet. And that's what makes conservation tricky. Remember, noise, which is devastating to the southern residents, doesn't seem to have the same effect on the Bigs population, but it's still something that needs to be considered. For all of them, the dams are one of the big problems with conservation to orcas in this region. And in the interest of journalistic integrity and just being honest with you, I have a bias towards the removal of the 4 lower Snake River dams. I'm not going to hide that from you. It's an incredibly nuanced discussion that goes on a whole variety of tangents, but the removal of the 4 lower Snake River dams is one of the big talking points for people in the rehabilitation of the salmon populations. Seeing traditional numbers of salmon rebound is the goal. And a lot of people believe that removing those dams or breaching them in specific terms, punching a hole in the middle and then allowing that river to run back to its natural course, is something that would allow the salmon population to come back. Because the orca are dependent, southern residents, on the population of these salmon, this is really a crown jewel in the whole conversation about maintaining their lives. If you're not familiar with the 4 lower Snake River dams, here's a little map so that you can better familiarize yourself with it. They are kind of that zone between Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. They're, of course, on the Snake River. And together they account for, at peak, probably 4% of the power grid that is generated here in Washington state. We have an exceptional amount of hydroelectric power generated in the state. These dams, unlike a lot of the other dams on the Columbia River, for example, don't have reservoirs that allow them to produce their maximum level of power in the seasons where it's most important. Let me break that down. In the spring, when there's a melt and a snowpack filling into that space, you can get a high level of efficiency out of these dams. And again, aging infrastructure, they're not as good as they once were, but they do produce a significant amount of electricity for the region. Not nearly as much as the dams, and not in peak seasons like fall and winter, where electricity usage spikes because there's less daylight and more cold. Because the lack of a reservoir doesn't allow them to be efficient when they are most needed, they've been deemed less useful than a lot of the other dams throughout Washington and the Pacific Northwest. Coupled with the fact that there are other ways to generate that same amount of electricity, and they could be done in other ways, are big parts of that conversation as well. Breaching the dam, though, has a lot of things that come with it, including the loss of a tremendous amount of farmland area, the relocation of individuals below because it would flood a lot of that area. And for me, there's an irony to the whole thing, because the people that are now, benefiting from those geographic things are the same people that are benefited from it because other people had to be relocated. When you're looking at dams and reservoirs, a lot of traditional, not even touching the indigenous conversation yet, you can look at other communities that had to have been removed or relocated due to eminent domain so that the flood path of those dams could then occupy that space. So indigenous communities have been, removed from the area. Fishing populations have been decimated. No matter what, whether there are dams, whether there are no dams, it has changed the geographic and cultural ennui and nuance of the area forever and always. And so it's a complicated conversation. For me personally, I see a tremendous amount of benefit to the removal of the Snake River dams and to allowing those populations of salmon and steelhead to rebound by going back to their traditional spawning territories. All of this said, it's part of the conversation about orcas. I encourage you to dig into it. There's a tremendous amount of research online that would allow you to look into it. This particular amount of information comes from the usa.oceana.org site with the prediction of salmon populations if the lower Snake River dams were breached and had 125% spill. This would allow, they predict, salmon populations to explode. But not to discount the fact that on the other end of the river, there is more that needs to be taken into account of. And one of them is estuaries. Estuaries are those periods where fresh and salt water mix, and they are essential to the life and times of salmon. As salmon leave their spawning grounds and start to mature into adulthood, they go out to the ocean, and they need a safe place to let their bodies acclimate to the saline-rich environment of the ocean. And an estuary is pivotal to that. It allows their bodies to start to make that gradual change. They can't just dive into the ocean, be somebody new. They have to take a gradual time to allow their bodies to change so that they can start to exist in that saline-rich environment. And estuaries are important to that. But estuaries have been destroyed en masse to allow for more commercial properties throughout the area. So yes, dams is one part of it. Micropollutants is another part. Estuaries are there, but undeniably, the population and health of salmon in the region is fundamental to the success of southern resident orcas. This part is undeniable. And there is a lot that we can do as individuals to help rebuild estuaries in the region and promote the right environment for salmon to exist, and thus orcas, southern residents in particular. The bigs, that's a whole nother conversation. But without further ado, let me introduce you to a genuine expert on this topic. She is going to introduce herself and then talk to you about orcas in the region and really allow us to all glean a little information. So without further ado.
My name is Stephanie Raymond, and I am the program manager and educator. Well, let me back up. I'm the program manager and an educator for Orca Network. We have a lot of different education staff. The orcas here in the Salish Sea are, it's a really special situation because we have the two different types of orcas who share the same habitat. And they are able, even though they're both apex predators, they're able to share this space because they're eating completely different diets. And they really have completely different cultures, languages. They don't understand each other. They don't interact with each other. They're two completely separate groups. And genetically, that's true as well. So our southern resident orcas are the critically endangered population of salmon-eating orcas. And we typically see them in South Puget Sound and by that I mean, any place south of Whidbey Island. We see them in fall and winter. They're following salmon runs in. And then we also have the bigs or transient orcas. Those are the mammal eaters. So they're taking advantage of our very abundant seal and harbor porpoise populations here. And those folks are around all times of year and actually have a wider range of travel within the inland waters of Puget Sound than the residents typically do. So the southern residents have a pretty predictable zone that they will show up in. They always surprise us. So you never want to assume that, if you're seeing an orca, it's one type or another until you know for sure. But the bigs or transient orcas tend to be the ones who you see south of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge and down into Carr and Case Inlet around Fox Island and all those points south.
Interesting. And so you mentioned that these two have two completely different cultures and diets. Is one line more traditional? Is there a type of orca that has been more historically seen in the Salish Sea?
Based on what we know from the research, which really only started seriously in the early 70s, the southern residents were the ones that were seen more frequently. And certainly as I was growing up here, that was, if there were orcas, they were almost always the southern residents. But we've seen a shift as the salmon populations have declined and as the marine mammal populations have increased. Our harbor seal and harbor porpoise populations are both really robust right now. So now we're seeing more of these mammal-eating orcas come in because it's a good food source, and they know it. And I just want to clarify that when we talk about, the home and, the resident orca versus the transient orca, they're always on the move. So, where they might be from day to day, because that's a question we frequently get, is where can I see the orcas? Where will they be at this time? We really don't know because, the common wisdom was that they could travel up to about 100 miles a day. And recently we had some travel even further in a very short period of time. So these animals can cover a lot of ground in a single day. And when we see them sticking around in one place day after day, that means that they've, most likely they've found a really good food source. And so they're going to stick around and take advantage of that for a while. The Biggs orcas are part of a population that extends all up and down the west coast of North America, anywhere from Alaska to even as far south as Baja California now. They are traveling back and forth. And in some cases, the same orcas have been identified separately, as in given different alphanumeric identification numbers by researchers in 2 different zones, because we didn't realize that they actually were traveling that far. So now we know that these are the same animals that are just using this entire space. Now we do have certain family groups that are more frequently seen here in the Salish Sea. But, you know, once or twice a year, we'll either see some whales here that are more frequently sighted in California or Alaska. And conversely, you know, some of our whales will wind up in either of those places.
Interesting. And how do you identify them? Is it by sight, or do they have trackers or markers or anything like that?
It's all done visually. The southern resident orcas are possibly the most studied marine mammal population on the planet, because when they come in, they're in a place where there's a lot of eyes on the water. And even folks who aren't familiar with the particular markings, so we're looking for the shape and size of the dorsal fin, that's their tall back fin, and then the white or gray patch behind that is called the saddle patch. So the combination of those is going to be unique to each orca. In some cases with the southern residents, there are genetic markers that are genetic patterns that show up in their saddle patches. So they might look like they have a Nike swoosh in them, for example, or they might have a line through them or something. Like there's some interesting patterns that happen in that population that don't happen in the Biggs population. So for the Biggs, we're looking at scarring or notches and nicks in the dorsal fin, and pieces like that. You can also tell them apart by looking at the eye patches. Those white patches over their eyes are unique to each individual as well, but that's not often as reliable. You know, they're not always going to show you that, but at least you should be able to get, you know, if you got a good camera with a good lens and, you know, a little luck, you can get the dorsal fin with the saddle patch together. And that's the primary way that we identify each one.
Can you talk to me a little bit about the major differences between the southern residents and the Biggs?
Yeah, so the southern residents tend to be slightly smaller than the Biggs. I mean, you know, within 2 or 3 feet, it's not a huge difference. To the untrained eye, they look identical. But again, with the Biggs orcas, that saddle patch is going to be one white solid patch, unless there happens to be some scarring that happened after the whale was born. They are traveling typically in small groups that are usually a mother and her immediate offspring. But we are learning as we research them more and as they are more present here in the Salish Sea that their family dynamics are a lot more fluid than we realized. And sometimes you have several groups of transients or Biggs traveling together in such large groups that sometimes they're mistaken for groups of southern residents, which are noteworthy because they don't leave their mothers after they're born. They spend their entire lives around their mom. So when you see the southern residents traveling together, you're typically seeing 2 or 3 generations, sometimes even 4 generations traveling together in a large extended family group of, you know, mom, grandma, cousins, sisters, whatever. With the Biggs orcas, that seems to be a little bit more linked to food supply. When they first started being more frequently spotted here in the Salish Sea, we were really seeing them coming in these smaller family groups. So usually not more than 4 to 6 animals at a time. But as the food supply has increased, we're seeing more of them traveling in larger groups. And sometimes those groups are related and sometimes they're not directly related. So those are a couple different things that we see.
And for the southern residents, because they followed this matrilineal setup, how many calves on average does one of these mothers have in her lifetime?
Well, with the southern residents in particular, that is a really critical question for this population. An orca female can have a calf about every 4 to 5 years. So gestation is around 18 months. And then they're nursing for roughly a year, and then there's another gestation. You know, there might be some overlap there, but so they have a similar reproductive lifespan to a human female. So reaching reproductive maturity about the same age and then losing fertility at about the same age. And so in that time period, even a really fertile, healthy female might only have 6 or 7 calves, 7 or 8 calves, maybe. With the southern residents, what we see is that while there are lots of conceptions, there are not many live births. And that has everything to do with food supply and toxics in the food chain and what is necessary for a female orca to sustain a pregnancy for that long period of time and then to nurse that pregnancy. So even if she does successfully give birth to a live calf, then how long will that calf survive? And when you consider that the toxic body burden that these animals have of different chemicals that are known to have reproductive effects and neurological effects and immunological effects, she's metabolizing some of her stored fat to grow that calf if she's not getting enough food to eat. And then she's also releasing some of those toxins into her milk when she's nursing that calf. So there's a really low fertility rate among the southern residents. We think it's about almost a 70% miscarriage rate. And that's a really critical factor when we think about this very limited population to start with, 74 individuals right now. And not all of them are female, obviously not all females, but there are not as many females of reproductive age as we would like there to be at the moment to really be able to grow that population back up to its historic levels.
And when you're talking about toxins, which ones are being traced that are having a known effect?
We're talking about fat soluble toxins, things like PCBs, PAHs, PBDEs, flame retardant chemicals, things that are, the PCBs, of course, are the really, really persistent industrial lubricants that have been banned in the United States for a really long time, but they're still out there in contaminated estuarine sediments and things like that. So it's all these things that are kind of classed as forever chemicals. They don't break down quickly in the environment. They stick around a long time and they store in fatty tissue. So that's something that, we as humans also experience to some degree. We're not eating a diet, well, not all of us are eating a diet that's high in salmon, but for populations who do eat a lot of salmon, they also have some impact from that as well. The primary concerns that have been identified for why the southern residents are in trouble. Number one, far and above, is lack of salmon. If they had enough to eat, the other issues would be still issues, but not nearly have the same impact that they do because there is not enough salmon. Toxics are the toxicants in the food chain are the other issue. And then the disturbance from vessel traffic. And so there is a new law that's coming into effect January 1st of 2025 that says that all recreational vessels need to stay 1,000 yards away from a southern resident orca. And there's a lot I could say about that, but I'll wait for specific questions because it's an interesting situation.
Okay, well, let's address that, and then I would love for you to be able to touch on the salmon conundrum.
Yeah.
As far as the recreational vessel rules and regulations, the one that I think is most glaring for me is how do you know if it's a southern resident?
Right. You always just assume that it is.
Okay.
That is the safest practice. And the idea really, the spirit behind the law is more about just helping people to understand that if there are orcas in the area, that doesn't mean go see them. It means go a different direction. Just give them some distance and let them be. Now, in my experience as a recreational boater myself, they are curious animals, and sometimes they will show up and you're not expecting it, and suddenly there's an orca there, or some other kind of whale. There's other whales here certainly too. Those aren't the things that, that's not what this law is looking at. This law is trying to prevent people from specifically approaching and trying to interact with the whales.
What are you supposed to do if an orca does come up to investigate? Do you move away? Do you hold still? Is it a Jurassic Park situation?
It depends on distance, right? If you are within 1,000 yards of a southern resident, you need to be clutched out if you can be. But there's the whole issue of navigational safety, right? So there's a common sense element to it. If you're in open water and you're not worried about, maybe, I mean, if you're fishing, for example, and your boat is stopped and suddenly there's an orca there, don't do anything. Just let it go by. Enjoy the moment, right?
Yeah.
If you realize that there are orcas in the distance, then you want to back away at 7 knots. You want to keep a nice, a slower boat is a quieter boat. So the slower that you're backing out of the situation, the less noise disturbance you're going to be providing for those whales.
Do you personally feel this is going to have a very positive impact?
Personally, I don't think it's going to make a huge difference. I think that, there are certainly bad actors out there who no rule is going to change how they behave around the whales, and that's really unfortunate. I think that the types of noise that different boats generate is not really being addressed by this law. And because there are some boats that are definitely a bigger issue than others, and recreational boats usually aren't it. But we do know that certainly at 400 yards, southern resident females will stop foraging as much if there are, if there are boats within that distance. So the present, at a certain distance, it does make a difference. And when we're talking about a population that's already very stressed and isn't finding what it needs, the fish that they're hunting for are fewer and smaller than they used to be. So they have to hunt more of these fish to make up their, the calorie needs that they're adapted to. Then yeah, we don't want anything happening that's going to be disturbing those animals, and keeping them from doing that.
I feel like one of the things I discuss the most in every tour that I do is salmon. And so from your perspective, what are the major contributing factors to the decline in salmon?
How long do we have again?
Yeah, exactly. Like it's a decades long question,
Yeah.
but I mean,
no, it's
where
death
do we
of
begin?
1,000 cuts. Yeah, it's death of 1,000 cuts. And I guess at the heart of it is habitat, but habitat by itself is a very broad thing, right? The simplest way that I know to explain it is that salmon need very specific types of habitat at every stage in their life. And human activity has found ways to disrupt every single one of those stages. So it's not just overfishing, which is one that people frequently want to point to. Certainly harvest is an issue. I don't want to, and we're learning more and more every day about what's happening out there in the Pacific Ocean with the salmon from here. So if you buy a wild Alaska caught salmon, that might have been a salmon that was destined for the Columbia Snake River system or for one of the rivers here in Puget Sound. That's possible. So it's not like they're not eating salmon that go to Alaska. There's also the issue of developing the estuaries, the places where the rivers meet the saltwater, and how there's been so much of that that's happened here. And in Seattle and Tacoma, that's in Everett, that's industrial area now, where there's been a lot of opportunity for both point source pollution and non-point source pollution entering the waterway, contaminating the sediment. Those baby salmon, as they're swimming downstream, not only now do they not have the backwaters and the places where they can't just go from freshwater to saltwater. They have to spend some time adjusting physiologically. It's a big adjustment to move from a freshwater to a saltwater environment. So historically, they would be using the wetlands and the estuaries to hide from predators and spend some time adapting to the different salt gradients as they came downstream. I used to work with somebody who described what happened to these estuaries as changing from a nice country road with lots of places that you could pull out and rest to turning it into a superhighway with no rest areas, because we're dredging these deep channels for big boats to come in. There's no place left for little fish to kind of find a shallow sheltered area to hang out for a while. And then upstream, we have the runoff from all the different kinds of land use, pet waste, oil leaking from cars, pesticides, herbicides, agricultural runoff, erosion from land practices that aren't paying attention to the vegetation. If people are clearing vegetation from a stream side or riverside because they want a view or something like that, that damages habitat for insects that the salmon need to eat when they're young. And then the shoreline habitat too, when we build bulkheads and other kinds of seawalls, that interferes with certain kinds of forage fish reproduction. And those forage fish are really essential for the salmon to eat before they start swimming back upstream again, so that they have the energy to make it up to their spawning grounds. And then, you take all of that and then layer global warming and, raising water temperatures on top of it. Those baby salmon, when they first emerge from their eggs, they need a really, really high level of dissolved oxygen in the water. And we know that cold water holds more oxygen than warmer water does. So as the water warms up, they just, they don't have a chance, which is again why that shade cover is so critical for the streams where the salmon are spawning. So there's just so many different pieces of it. If it were simple, we would have fixed it by now.
Would you say fair to say that the health and success of the southern residents is an overall marker for the health and success of the region?
Yeah, they are absolutely the apex predator of the entire Salish Sea. So, and they also rely heavily on the Columbia Snake River salmon runs as well. So they're definitely a real indicator of the health of the overall watersheds in those, that one big river system of the Columbia Snake, and then also the smaller river systems within the Salish Sea watershed.
Like I said, there's so much to be taken on, and this is such a cursory view, but I would like to ask you kind of in closing, first of all, what would you want someone's takeaway from this all to be?
Well, I've heard a lot of people speculate about the southern residents' potential for survival and how, what can we really do? And what I would say is those whales are always surprising us, even when we feel like, there weren't any live births for a lot of years, and then suddenly there's a whole bunch of them, and many of those calves are still alive and thriving now. So they're doing their part. If we can do our part, they can do their part, and they are really extraordinary animals. We understand so little about them still, and I think that they are just as involved in trying to recover their population as we are in our own way. I also think it's really important because now the southern residents, because of new regulations, the only opportunities people have to see them is from shore. And that's not a bad thing necessarily, but it does mean it's harder for people to engage with them. People don't know these whales as individuals anymore. And that is really important to do, because we do know each of these animals as individuals with personalities and families and stories. So I think that, as we're faced with these seemingly really onerous tasks of how do we solve these difficult problems, remembering to learn about these animals and who they are as individuals, that I think that's something that really inspires me and keeps me going, because I have if you will, I have friends in that population, so it's very personal for me, and I think that creating those personal connections really helps with people understanding why it's important to take the actions that we need to take, and that we can do what's necessary. And the other thing is that if it's good for whales, it's good for us too. All of the issues that they are facing to one extent or another, particularly around climate change and toxins, arguably even things like noise pollution, right? These are all things that affect us as well. So if we are creating a habitat and a world where the orcas are getting what they need, then that's going to be good for all of us too.
Well, then what's the last part here? Where can people find out more or become involved in any way with the Orca Network?
We have a website, orcanetwork.org, And from there, there is so much that you can learn. We have a ton of educational resources there. We also have our volunteer application there. So if people want to get involved further, they can fill that out and choose which one of our programs they're interested in. We have our whale sighting network, which you can also follow on Facebook. And that's true even if you don't have a Facebook account, because it's a public page. So if you're curious where the whales are on a given day, go to Orca Network on Facebook. And if we've had any reports, we will put them out there. Anybody who sees a whale can report it back to us. And that becomes part of a huge data set that researchers use to look at the different trends for whale behavior here in the Salish Sea. And the Langley Whale Center on Whidbey Island is a really lovely little spot to visit. It's got some great exhibits, and we do youth events and other special events throughout the year. So that's another spot you can learn some stuff. You can volunteer to be a docent there too and help other people learn about the whales. And finally, we have a YouTube channel that's also got lots and lots of information for folks who just want to know more about the whales in general and how Orca Network does things.
Thank you so much for
You're
taking
so
the time
welcome,
today.
Chris. Thank you.
The presence of orcas in the region is a tremendous treat, and it is something that has been a part of this community and area for longer than anyone here can remember. There is an opportunity, and in fact, I would say a demand now, that we take action to ensure the longevity of orcas in this region. And so there are so many resources from the Orca Network and beyond where I would encourage you to get involved and become part of the solution. I hope to see you all out there on June 29th at Ocean Fest down at the Foss Waterway Seaport building right here in Tacoma. And as always, my friends, if you have questions or comments, please let me know. I'm excited for this conversation, and I always encourage you to get on out there and keep on exploring.